Enjoy the fellowship. Well, we need to get started in covering our class this morning. Appreciate you being here. Do that. Oh, here they are. My notes. So we are reading through the Bible, and since this is the last Sunday of February, there is the reading material for March. It's on the foyer out there. And of course, online, you can get that through the weekly email bulletin. There's an access to the entire year's worth there. And of course, as we go through, we're keeping this question in mind: what is important to God? As we read through this and want to keep that in the forefront, actually, as we read through it. What is important to God here that I'm reading? And we're asking you to journal, whatever that looks like to you. That means writing down what you read, or writing down the questions and saying, what does this mean? What's going on here? I think this is what's important. So journaling and recording your thoughts, and it will also help crystallize what you're thinking if you'll do that. And if you don't have one of these, or if you filled yours up already, there's some extras up here, and we'd be glad to help you to journal that. So appreciate it. We are reading through, and so this last week we have read through 1 Kings 3 through 10, 1 Chronicles 29, finished 1 Chronicles, got 9 chapters into 2 Chronicles and 3 different Psalms. And I suppose I should let you know, Roger Gamble actually found out this week that his grandson's final home game in baseball was up in Kansas, and so he said, I found out about it Wednesday. He said, grandsons are like that, They've known about it for weeks, but they didn't tell him. So glad he is able to enjoy the baseball game with his grandsons. Said, not sure I'll make it back. So I didn't see him, so I know he didn't make it back and got to go. So in the reading, this is just some of the summary that Solomon made king. And when we finish this, I'm going to ask you what's important to God and what's your questions. So give you a chance to respond there. So Solomon was made king, and the Lord tells him, ask what I shall give you. Adoniah requests Abishag the Shunammite, that's misspelled again, be given to him as a wife, that's me. Solomon starts a building projects, the temple, a palace, a house for Pharaoh's daughters, cities, walls, all kinds of things. When they dedicate the temple, there's a week-long festival and what goes on there. And then they just start talking about the peace that they have on all sides and the economic prosperity that happens in Israel. So, what did you notice this time you haven't noticed before? What do you have questions about? What stands out to you? What's important to God? Damn. You notice that this time, one of the reasons that they can do all these building projects is they're not at war. Because when you're at war, resources go to that. And so they have been granted, and that's made several points several times. They were granted peace on all sides. In fact, not only peace, but they also exported war equipment to their northeast neighbors, to the Hittites and the Syrians. I had missed that. I don't know if anybody else picked that up. Part of what Solomon was buying horses and chariots from Egypt, and he sold them to the Hittites, which are up in modern-day Turkey, and to the Syrians. I'm sure he added a middleman fee to that as well. What else did you notice?
It's something I didn't notice necessarily for the first time, but always sticks out when I read it is what Solomon asked for. Wisdom when God asks him whatever you want. It's interesting to me that it's a very wise request to ask for wisdom. I don't know, chicken and the egg, I guess.
Yeah. When David first put Solomon in place to begin working on the temple, and all, he said, Solomon's young. He doesn't have experience and wisdom, and you called on his leaders of the nation to help Solomon along. So I'm wondering just how overwhelmed Solomon felt. And so what was on his heart at that point when God says, what do you want? This job scares me. Because we know that from the text, Solomon loved the Lord. And he's now in place of being over the people and ruling God's people. I mean, he is the president and the Congress and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court all rolled into one. What do you do with all that? He is the sovereign. So questions come up. It's like, how do I, one of the questions is, let me be able to discern right from wrong. How do you do that? Renee?
Reflection on this morning's sermon, I wonder if, may be getting no answer to, if Solomon recognized there are different types of wisdom, and that he was seeking wisdom from God.
Good connection. Different kinds of wisdom. Solomon wants God's wisdom. Good point. John?
I thought it was interesting where this exchange takes place over Solomon offering all of these bowls and God saying, what is it that you desire? Because we would think, well, that would happen, in front of the altar in Jerusalem. It doesn't. It happens at a high place. It happens not at the place where I had expected that to happen.
Okay, let's talk about that a little bit. Where did that actually happen? What was the name of the town? Ooh. Wasn't Shiloh. It was Gibeon. What's at Gibeon? Gibeon. No, not Gibeon, not Gideon. Gibeon. Interesting that this came out to me, that I put something else together tonight. Do you remember what John talked about with the Gibeonites? They're not Israelites. They're the ones that fooled Joshua and the Israelites into thinking they were from a long way, and they're right there in the middle. The town of Gibeon is actually about 5 miles northwest of Jerusalem. Okay. So this happens at a high place, the most important high place, which is the center of this Canaanite town. But those Canaanites had been tasked with being woodcutters and water bearers. What do you need lots of wood for and lots of water for? Sacrifices at the tabernacle. The tabernacle was at Gibeon. That's why he went there. It was on the bronze altar. The tabernacle is at Gibeon. What's at Jerusalem? Temple isn't built yet, but yeah, it will be. The ark. The ark is in a tent that David erected for it in the city of David in Jerusalem. I hadn't picked up until this time going through that. It's, wait a minute, the ark is with the tabernacle. Nope, they got separated. They're about 5 miles apart. I did not read across or come across any explanation as to why, other than that whenever they were going to war during Saul, they would take the ark because that's the presence of God, and we want God to go with our army, so they took the ark out. And that's how the Philistines captured it, and it came back, and all that story. So, but they're separated. There was something else mentioned about the ark that I found interesting this time. It says the only thing in the ark is the tablets of the covenant. And the jar of manna. And the stuff that the Philistines, the hemorrhoids and the mice. I don't know what happened to those other things. I went back and looked at what does it say about Aaron's rod and the jar of manna, and it says, put them in the presence of the Lord. I always thought that meant putting them in the ark. Maybe it doesn't. But they're not mentioned anywhere, and I'm thinking, what happened to them? The other thing I'm wondering is, who looked inside? and apparently didn't die. I have no answers to that. I just noticed it, and it was, wait. It wasn't what I was taught. I was taught that when I was little, that the jar of manna and Aaron's rod were put in the ark. But when I went back and read it for myself, it says they were put them before the presence of the Lord. And keep them there. That will be a sign forever. But what happened to them, I have no idea. They're not mentioned. John.
I think you make a great point, is that we were all taught by goodwill people growing up. And maybe what they were teaching was something that they had been taught by goodwill people. And a lot of us still remember the teaching that we got when we were in 3rd grade, 5th grade, 8th grade, whatever it was, in Bible class. And these readings that we get to do are really a unique opportunity, just like you had that moment of, wait a minute, this isn't the way I was taught, and it doesn't line up. And I just think about how humble we need to be, and how it's important for us to read. And it's important for us to let the text be the text. All of these things kind of swirl together.
Yeah, they do kind of. And it's one of those things that I hope some of you will look at that and go, wait a minute, you said it was put into the presence and not in the ark? You're going to go look that up this week, aren't you? Good. Debbie?
So you're mentioning that the tabernacle was in Gibeon, and in backing up to, another reading from another week, we know that David brought the tabernacle to Jerusalem, the ark to Jerusalem, and that's all the dancing and fun. And my Bible says they brought the ark of God and set it in the midst of the tabernacle that David had erected. So he must have erected just a nice shelter, because that's what tabernacle means. It doesn't have a capital T or anything. So he just erected some type of place for it.
He erected a tent for the ark in Jerusalem. So, yeah.
tabernacle to Jerusalem? Who knows, right?
I don't know. That's how you go off into supposition, and how it's like, well, put it in the presence of the Lord means putting it in the ark. Maybe not. So yeah, to going back, but I think you're right, because all of us are given, or we develop lenses through which we read Scripture. And how we can have different perspectives. John and I this week, we got an email, and he read it one way and I read it another. And it's like, well, wait. And so as we got to talking, I went back and looked at it and was like, okay, you could read it, we come out with either meaning. And like, so we need to check out which meaning the author meant. So we read the Scriptures and we come to it with all of our past and with the images that we've developed, which may or may not be true. For me, some of those flannel graph images may not be right. You know,
Somebody actually raised their hand.
I was just gonna say, and how we talk about certain characters, I think, is interesting too. You know, when you're doing heroes of the Bible for VBS, you gotta have a certain amount, so, but, you know, how we talk about Jonah, how we talk about even Solomon. Like, Solomon's problematic for me because it says he was a man who prayed for wisdom and got it, but having wisdom to rule is not the same as being disciplined to live. You know, and so he knew what was right, but he still, with that wisdom, made choices. I mean, you get to the end of his life, I know we're not quite there yet, but, you know, he's sacrificing on altars, on mountains to gods that are not Yahweh.
I think the thing that's missing is the heart, and it's the coupling of the two, which most people don't have. They have wisdom or they have the heart, but it's very rare to have both. A heart for God. I mean, even though it does say in Chronicles that David has chosen Solomon the youngest, because it's a choice from God.
Yeah. Sorry, Zach, sorry, just
Yeah, when we start talking about, I was thinking about the Ten Commandments being in the Ark and what that means in the context of what's important to God. You know, and the question that I asked myself is did that change given that he chose that my commands are what's going to be important here, you know. If you're gonna put anything in the Ark, make it these commands. I think that when you talk about, you know, growing up with flannel graphs and separating ourselves from that perception that we have of the Bible through somebody else's lens, or the Mandela effect or whatever it is, that we ask the question as we read what's important to God, we can take that very simply, saying, well, he made it a point to say now it's the Ten Commandments. You know, so at this point, is that what's important to God? Is that why Aaron is rod and the manna is no longer in there, because they don't need to be reminded because they're not a nomadic people anymore. They're stuck in a place. Not stuck, but they have arrived. So.
it's interesting, you just, Jerry?
I think if we step back and look at the big picture here of the temple, a lot of what we read was about the opulence of the temple. You know, I mean, the gold, and the cedars of Lebanon, and the cherubs and everything. But in the big picture, this temple only lasted 400 years. It was destroyed by the Babylonians. And after, you know, later on, the second temple began, and long history there with that temple, but it too was destroyed by the Romans. No matter how many temples we build, they're not going to live and survive. And I think what's important to God is that he dwells in temples not made with hands. Yes. To me, that's what's important to God. There are a lot of scriptures in the New Testament about that, about the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. And now our body is the temple of God. So, you know, I guess looking at the whole thing, I think that's what's important to God. You know, we've been through all this history and all these things, but what's important is that our bodies are now the temple of God.
Good point. And I'm already becoming very aware this body is not lasting as well as I would like for it to. Renee?
Exactly, no, my Bible class references over to Revelation 11:19. Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and the ark of his covenant was seen within his temple. And so if we think in terms of, what is most important to God and what was left in the ark, or the commandments, and I'm the temple, and the ark is then within me, his commandments are what are so significant to me. Also, the rod of Aaron that shows his protection, and the manna, his provision, those are things too that are within me by his Spirit.
And we can draw a lot from that. And I also wanted to say, we have shortened it to the ark. We know what that means. What's the expanded wording? It's the ark of the covenant. Yeah. Rick?
Just so you know why we were taught what we were taught, Hebrews 9:4 does list those components of the ark, those contents.
Oh, good, okay. Being in the ark?
Yeah.
Okay.
I thought there was only sand in the ark when there's.
You say that. I had a friend of mine that as an adult, he went back and watched the Ten Commandments. He actually watched it. And he was amazed to realize that the images that he had had all his life about what the Red Sea looked like and all that whole story, he did not remember. If you ask him before then, he said, I never saw the Ten Commandments. Because it always came on Sunday night and they were at church. But at some point he saw it, because when he saw it as an adult, he went, that's the image I've always had of that. And realized that those images came from a movie. So, not from what he imagined on his own. So it's interesting how we work like that. I saw a hand over here, I thought.
So I was going back to the whole temple thing, if we're ready to move on. The whole opulence of the temple, I thought it was amazing, like the way, he builds these alliances and these trades and, all that goodness. But so I just can't imagine, you walk in this place, it's just the most beautiful. I mean, everything's gold and cedar and glorious. And what kind of made me giggle, which probably is the wrong reaction, but when God comes in, he shuts the place down. And he's dark, right? He comes in, he's not bright white light. He comes in, he's dark cloud, and you don't see the opulence of the temple because of the glory of God, and that's what pushed the people out. I thought it was interesting that all this work for, like that's what made me giggle. It's like, well, now no one gets to see my pretty birds and flowers I put up everywhere.
Yeah, when they dedicated the temple and offering the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord descends on it, all of a sudden they can't offer the sacrifices anymore because they can't see to do it, and they're outside.
It's interesting, kind of in modern history, the Temple Mount is about 35 acres or so, something like that. And at various times, the Jews have prohibited people from going onto the Temple Mount because they might accidentally go into the Holy of Holies. No one knows where it is anymore, but there's just all kinds of history related to that, and just that 35 acres has not even really been excavated archaeologically, because that was considered not something to do in that area. So
Because it is holy.
yeah, there's very little evidence today that we can see, of Solomon's temple. That kind of thing. So, interesting part of the world.
Yeah, very interesting part of the world. So,
Back to what Jerry alluded to earlier, when he as elaborate and as amazing as a builder as Solomon was, when he finished that work, and just shortly after that, God appeared to him again and had to warn him, you know, look, this is all good, this is fine, but, man, if you people don't do like I say, or you're not following me, which is what is most important, I'm gonna wipe you out, man. I'm gonna get rid of it. I'm gonna be done with you almost, is what God says.
Yeah. He does that in most every case. Is like, okay, I'm going to grant your request. If you do what I say, I will give you long life, peace, people. Because at the dedication of the temple, it was a case of, how do you phrase it? Wherever we're at, if we sin, if we turn to the temple, if we repent and we pray, hear us. And he says, okay, I'm going to do that. As long as you walk in my ways, you're good. But if you walk away from me, then I will not leave my name in this place. I will destroy it, and I will scatter you, and it will be such a desolate place that people will go, why did the Lord do that to them? And even the pagans will answer, it's because they forsook the Lord. Brett?
Once they finished this first temple, it seems that they turned their attention more to the building than to whom it was built for. And that continued all the way through the disciples, because they're walking with Jesus and they say, oh Lord, look at this great big building here.
Mm-hmm.
They were more concerned about the building than what it was for.
Yeah, sorry about
And he told them, you know, look, this is just a building. You know, in 70 AD, this is gonna be a pile of rubble.
He knew they had a heart condition, and it was not right. It was not aligned with him, as Jerry said earlier. He knew that as amazing as this was, and as great a wise builder and leader as Solomon was, he had a heart condition. God knew it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he spent 7 years building this temple. Now consider this. You read the numbers, the thousands, tens of thousands of people that he conscripted to do the work. So it's 70, 100,000 if you want to add them together. People doing the work, a lot of it off-site, and then bringing it together, putting it together, and it's 7 years of that. Now, and the thing that, like Brett mentioned, with the disciples looking at that building, that was Herod, at that time, had spent 20 years renovating an existing building and adding to it. And it was impressive for their time. Was not as impressive as Solomon's. I mean, yes. Well, his I would think I would call it his palace complex. Yeah, because when you look at it, what was it? There was there was the house of the forest of Lebanon. There was the hall of pillars. There was a hall of throne, even the hall of judgment, which I don't know if that means it's one or two buildings. And the throne room is in that, and then his own house, and then the house for Pharaoh's daughter. So when you look at all that, a lot of readings I was saying said, well, it wasn't one building, it was a complex, a capital city complex. That's where the government buildings were. So it wasn't just one building. And one of the things that was mentioned several times in there, which I looked at, and I don't know if you did, the Millo. Talk about, and he built the Millo. Okay. What's a Millo? You know, you've heard that, right? You know, I've got a hen weigh. About 3-4 pounds. That's how much a hen weighs. It's a dad joke. Come on. So I did some research. A Millo. it comes from, we're not real sure what it is, but it was important because it's mentioned multiple times in the Bible to the people of Jerusalem. Millo apparently comes from the Hebrew word that means fill, and so they've got some theories about it. One is that it was an area that became known as the landfill by Kidron Valley. The other part is that it was actually a wall around Jerusalem where they build stones on either side and then fill it with dirt. But there's been some recent excavation where there's a series of stone steps going up to the wall that they think was a part of the palace. And they think that was the Millo, is the stone steps filling up and supporting the wall, which the palace was on the external wall, they think. So, not really sure what it is, but it's mentioned as part of something that David worked on and Solomon and other places. So, I run like that sometimes. I'm like, okay, it says that. What is that? But it's an amazing set of projects that he is building all over the country. Fortified cities, rebuilding Gezer. Historically, what happened was, as a wedding present for his daughter, Pharaoh invaded Philistine and wiped out the town of the Philistine city of Gezer and gave it to Solomon as a deal. And Solomon went down and rebuilt the city. John?
I often have wondered if this temple shouldn't have been built a couple hundred years earlier, right after the Exodus. Because the people that leave at the Exodus are trained builders, trained craftsmen. They are the people who built the most amazing structures known in the world at that point in time. They left with all the Egyptians' gold, all of their silver, all the materials that they would need. They had everything to basically just, and God had said, look, you don't even need to fight your way through Canaan. I'm going to drive everybody out in front of you with hornets. And so I always kind of wondered if the Israelites, if they had done it right, if they had just accepted God's providence and accepted God's leading, if that group from the Exodus wouldn't have already built Jerusalem. I don't know, but I can't imagine that the original idea was that all of that potential that God took out of Egypt after building a nation for 400 years under the Egyptians, the potential of a nation, the plan was to let them die in the desert. I mean, that was their choice.
Yeah, that was not his idea.
Right.
But then again, it wasn't God's idea to build a temple anyway. David built a house and went, wait a minute, God is important to me. I'm living in a house and he's still in a tent. Now, I have done camping and I'm pretty comfortable with it, but I am more comfortable in my house than in a tent. I'm just telling you. And I've seen some pretty fancy tents. I still want to live with someplace with solid walls. And that was, why should I live in a better place than my God? So it was David's heart, and that's when it said, well, no, not you, your son. But in his prayer of dedication, what does Solomon say about the place? It's a place to meet you. This can't contain you. The heavens and the earth, the entire universe, cannot contain God, much less this house, this building.
Security. You think about, for 9.5 years, we worshiped at a school. And I think we were more outward focused, if I'm honest, when we were at the school than we are in a building. But we would also have people come and visit and go, man, you guys are doing great things. When you get a building, let us know. We're going to come join. And I was like, that's not what But I think Israel was doing it too. It's like, oh, now we've arrived. And if you look at early Christianity, they started meeting in homes, but eventually we need to start building cathedrals. And I think it does something, you know, that might be a whole other discussion, but I think about it a lot when I think about the temple. As someone pointed out, they were asking Jesus what he thought about the temple, and Jesus was like, you know, I'm the temple.
Yeah.
So, something to think about.
I
Yeah.
thought about that a lot, Larry. I think you and I even had a conversation about it one time. Is God pleased with us building these structures? And you look at the resources that are spent on facilities, and they're great, and they're wonderful, and they're tools of God. I get it. They're tools to be used to His glory. But, man, I don't read in Scripture anywhere where we're authorized to own land and build a building. I don't see it there. So, it's just something to think about, like Darrell says.
And, yeah, been down that road. Well, we have a building. But it's also important to remember that this thing is not holy. You are what's holy.
And I think it's what you do. If it's a tool, let's use it. If it's a crutch, let's get rid of it.
Mm-hmm. And so we want this building to be used a lot. Jerry?
Well, changing the subject a little bit, there were a couple of interesting characters that showed up in this reading. One of them was Asaph, and he, of course, the writer of a lot of the Psalms, and he shows up in Second Chronicles as part of the celebration. So I thought it was interesting to see that. The other one was Ben-Hur, and I thought, wow, I've never seen that before, and certainly there's no relationship with the 1959 movie, as I found out, but it was interesting to see his name as we were reading that.
Glad you read through all those names. Now, so here's a trivia question for you. How many Hirams are there? At least two, maybe three. There's the Hiram that's the king of Tyre. Then there's a Hiram that is sent that is son of a widow of Dan. But there's the Hiram Abi, or Huram. In Hebrew, they're not that different, apparently. Abi is master, that is the bronze worker. That's mother is from Naphtali. I don't know, 2, 3. So when you read a name, it may or may not be the same one as the one you were thinking. You have to run some of that down. In fact, Hiram and Huram Abi are both mentioned, which is the text, in the same paragraph, and both as workers of bronze in 2 Chronicles. So it's like, how many are there? How many were you actually talking about? I'm not sure. So, okay, I've got Brett and then Dale.
I think during Solomon's reign, Israelites realized the full extent of Samuel's warning. If you have a king, he will do X, Y, Z. And they wound up, you mentioned forced labor earlier. Well, that's what they got.
Yeah.
And then you see what happened when his son comes to power, and then the people are fed up.
Yeah. Dale? Good.
Well, I was all prepared to talk about King Hiram of Tyre, and then you cast now doubts in my mind that we're talking about the same one, because it starts out with Hiram, king of Tyre, and his servants, and he's the one who's called on to build. And historically, when I read this, I go, you're calling on some Canaanite to come here and build your temple for you. And I'm going, this sounds like sacrilege. It sounds like totally wrong. And then this time, for the first time, I saw that where he calls Hiram out of Tyre. And it does, let's see, doesn't say it's King Hiram, it just says, and I had connected the two, and I go, this explains why this guy was all happy about, he loved David. It's like, oh, it's because he's half, he's from the tribe of Naphtali. Now, it was being all explained, and now I doubt it.
It's one of those like, what's your perspective on this? And, it sounds like it's different, because how can you run a kingdom up there and be down here casting bronze all the time? And huge amount of bronze. I mean, the altar was a handbreadth in thickness. Incredible. In the last few minutes, let me run a couple of things by you. One, we talked about the wealth, an incredible amount of wealth. How much is Solomon's annual amount of gold was 666 talents. How much is 666 talents of gold? We're talking tonnage. One talent, depending on where you go in history, is anywhere from 50 to 130 pounds. Solomon's, they think it was around 75 pounds. One talent is 75 pounds. That means we're talking about 50,000 pounds of gold every year. Now, right now, gold is worth about $22,372 a pound, so his annual income is $1.1 billion. Just from that gold trade, not counting what he was buying from the Egyptians and selling to the Hittites, or the money that was coming from the taxes of the economy, or the fleet of ships that was going out and trading and coming back and bringing back 420 talents of gold every 3 years. And that's a lot of commerce and a lot of money that God is funneling into this nation of his people. And it doesn't scratch the surface of his wealth. Yeah. And not just by the opulence, but by the wisdom. She'd ask questions, and he had the answer about animals, about plants, about anything. Except women. The great mystery. But I would like to make the point to you that all of that money was not what was important to God. The temple, it is opulent, and the palace and all that is fantastic, and we'd all look at that and go, wow, is not what was important to God. What did he keep telling Solomon? This is what is important to me. Walk according to my statutes and my commandments.
Same charge that David gave Solomon.
Mm-hmm.
It's fun. Being of God's own heart, we talked about that pretty nauseam.
Yeah. God's encouragement to Solomon was, be like your dad. Keep your heart devoted to me. Walk in my commandments and my statutes and do what I tell you to do. That's what's important to God. This stuff is not. More than any, God has all the wealth in the universe. What he is concerned about is you and your heart. That's what he wants.
So I think that brings like the evolution of God's relationship with people kind of full circle, because you start with people in personal relationship with God in the garden, and then they decide that they want to decide what's right and wrong for themselves, right? And so they're cast out. And then they have a tabernacle, and then eventually a temple where God says, this is like, you used to be with me, but now this is where heaven and earth intersect, right? I come to you through the tabernacle or through the temple, and you can look to this place and say, that's where the presence of God reminded of all the things that he's done for us and follow that. But then that still doesn't work out for them, and God says, okay, I'm actually coming to you in this person, right? And then the result is that he's in our heart instead of being in a building that we don't listen to.
Yeah. Good. Where do we connect with God? Now, part of the wisdom that was given to Solomon that we read was that he wrote 3,000 proverbs and 1,005 songs. So going forward this next week, we're going to get into some of the proverbs, first 22 chapters or so. As you look through those, as you write, as you journal about that, what is important to God? Appreciate you being here. We'll take a look at that next week. If you've got children, please go rescue the teachers.